our focus is on three constructs: metacognition, growth mindset, and grit, and how they relate to academic success. I'm going to be sharing some strategies, some things that you can maybe use in your classes, and I'm hoping you too will kind of share what you're doing with the rest of us. So I'm going to call on kind of the collective experience in this room as well. But to get going, what I'd like you to do is think about these two questions first. What do you already know about these three constructs, metacognition, growth mindset, and grit? And what questions do you already come to this session with? So just think for a moment. What do you know about these three topics? And what questions do you have? And just as you're thinking to yourself, I'd like you to just turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself if you don't know your neighbor, and just have a quick conversation about what do you already know and what questions do you have. And just look around, make sure everyone's, you might have to pull out your chair a little bit, make sure everyone's kind of involved in a little conversation, 2 or 3 people, whoever's around you. Just a short conversation to get things going. So go ahead, introduce yourself to your neighbors and have a quick conversation about the topic. And I need to pull everyone back. So, let's talk about where we're going to head for the next 80 minutes or so. In a moment, I'll go in depth and unpack each of these constructs so that everyone in the room kind of has a good kind of common understanding of metacognition, growth mindset, and grit. Then we'll get into the strategy piece. I've got some strategies, there's some handouts. I'll also provide digital copies of these in case you want to use some of them and maybe modify them slightly to your teaching context. So I'll go through some metacognitive strategies, and then we'll go into growth mindset. And I'll share some of the strategies that I've been using with the students at UBC Okanagan and a few other locations at universities around the world. And grit as well, same thing. I've developed a framework around grit, and I'm going to share that framework with you, and we'll talk about strategies about developing student grit. And then at the end, we're going to pull it all together, and you'll kind of reflect on all the things that we've done here in the room and how you might use anything in your context. So that's where we're headed. Let's get started with these three constructs. So what do they all have in common? Well, first of all, they all can be taught. If they couldn't be taught, we wouldn't be here right now. So it's really key that we realize that we can develop all three of these traits in our students. Secondly, all of the three indicate a relationship with academic success. And that's another important piece. We want our students to be successful, and all three of these help and support student success. And something that I'm going to be kind of making an argument throughout this presentation, or actually session, is that metacognition and growth mindset support students with reaching their goals. That's that academic success piece, and that really is what grit is. Grit is the ability to overcome challenges to reach your goals. So metacognition and growth mindset support grit and students reaching their goals. Let's start pulling it apart. So metacognition we'll start with. Now metacognition, obviously humans have always been metacognitive and had the ability to think about their thinking. But Flavel in the 70s, mid-70s, a Stanford prof, really coined the term metacognition. And he just kind of simply put it about being able to monitor your thinking, what's going on. When you're reading a book, you're sitting there reading, then all of a sudden you realize you have no idea what you read the last 2 pages. Why? Because you were thinking about dinner. It's that monitoring of your thinking, and we all have that ability. And I'll break it down a little bit further, but metacognition really help students to be able to plan, monitor, and evaluate their learning. And a lot of us, as educators, are putting more and more emphasis on students to be self-directed. We want our students to be lifelong learners so that they can go into new contexts and learn. Now, how do we help our students get there? Well, that's going to be strategies in a moment. But I want you to think for a moment in your context. I'm going to give you a scenario. And I want you to think about how many of your students are at this stage. So if you give your students a paper, do your students do this? So you've just assigned a paper. So self-directed learners, the first thing they do is assess the demands of the task. So if I gave my students a paper, do they assess the demands and say, what is Dr. Arthur really asking me to do with this paper? Yes, I know it's a 7 to 8 page. I have to use X number of primary sources. Do they cognitively think and break down, what am I actually doing for this paper? Hopefully, I've conveyed some of that in some kind of form, whether it's telling them directly or an assignment handout. But then after they've kind of figured out what the task is all about, they evaluate their own knowledge and skills. So they think to themselves, well, I've done papers before. I'm a decent writer, not a strong writer. I'm okay with finding resources in the library because I know I have librarians there to help me. So they start already thinking about where their strengths and weaknesses are because they develop a plan for their approach. They have this paper or major project that needs to be done, so they create a plan. And they break down the tasks and when they're going to do it, what strategies they're going to do, and maybe even thinking about, well, my writing isn't very strong, so I'm going to maybe go to the writing center. Maybe I'm going to go and see my prof. Maybe I've got a friend, Sally, who is a strong writer. I'm going to get her to give me a little assistance. And so they've created a plan. And they monitor their progress. As they get their paper going, they monitor and they adjust their strategies as needed. Where they might fall down or where there might be problems, they'll change the strategy. And then, on completion, they'll reflect on that whole process they went through. Why? So that they learn how to learn even more effectively. They'll reflect and say, well, next time I'm going to go to the library a lot earlier and find resources and talk to a librarian, for example. So what this is an expert learner. They assess the demands of the task. They know themselves. They evaluate their strengths and weaknesses. They make a plan. They monitor. And then at the end, they reflect on their whole learning process to become a more effective learner. What % of your students are at that stage where they've got this nailed?
10% maybe?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. 10 sounded good. I was going to be negative and say 5, but 10's good.
I think so too. 10's about a good number. I go to a lot of institutions. I hear 10 a lot. And so we have 10%, they've got this. But what about the other 90%? Can we teach this to them? Yes.
Well, I know that the last time I taught a class, Ken, I taught a class for general success in college, thriving in college is what it was called. And I really, as the instructor, tried to explain why I was giving them the assignment I was giving, how it related to the assignment they had previously.
Good.
So that I was trying to teach them that there was a purpose.
Yes.
For that it's not just busy work. I really do have a reason for this. And I was hoping that as I did that over the 10 weeks, that they would approach all of their classes with that same, why am I doing this assignment?
Right.
And kind of going through that approach.
That's good. Today we'll talk about a strategy to help them do this, break this kind of thing down for themselves and kind of learn a process to doing projects, major assignments, and that kind of thing, so that they begin to plan and monitor their learning. One of the issues, when I was the director for the Center for Teaching and Learning, the science and engineers profs came to me and said, Peter, our students all have to have an A to get into our program. However, they don't know how to learn how to learn. And so that's when I started with the metacognition. And I started developing interventions to help students become more metacognitive. And it was beyond just metacognition. That's why I got into growth mindset and grit. We'll talk about that in a minute. But a real key is helping them plan and monitor and evaluate their own learning. And that's something that they weren't doing. And in my research, kind of demonstrated the importance of being able to plan and monitor your learning, but they weren't able to because they weren't coming to us already with those types of skills. So I looked at interventions that were really key for first year classes especially. And they take very little time. Why do they take little time? Because first year's classes have this much content and this much time. So the focus is, how can we make changes, interventions for our students with small amounts of time but big impact? And that's what we'll look at today. Let's talk about growth mindset. How many of you have kind of been involved with growth mindset, know the term growth mindset? Oh, good, good. It's getting around. It's really heavy in the K-12 sector, and I find less and less in the university sector, university college sector. Now, basically, a student with a fixed mindset believes that they're born with a certain amount of intelligence and there isn't anything they can do about it. Students with a growth mindset believe, yes, they're born with a certain amount of intelligence, but through effort, they can grow their intelligence. And it's a huge difference. And in my research, I've polled over 2,500 students, and our first year students coming in are at about a 60-40 split, where 40% of our students believe that they were born with a certain amount of intelligence and there wasn't much they can do about it. And that causes all sorts of issues because they can't control how much intelligence they're born with. They can control effort, and that's key. We want our students to be able to feel that the more effort they put in, the more they will learn. It's interesting because a lot of you may know the example around math. Some of our students feel, I've been bad at math all my life, and there's nothing I can do about it. My sister was bad at math, my brother was bad at math, my dad was bad at math, so I'm just bad at math and there's nothing I can do. And they have that fixed mindset, which really bogs them down. So how do we get past that? And it's interesting because that math student, that student who feels so fixed and feels like no matter how hard they try, there's nothing they can do, what are they doing on Saturday? Well, they spend about 5-6 hours playing football. Why? Because they know the more time and effort they put into football, they'll get better at. So they have a growth mindset in football and a fixed mindset towards math or intelligence. And a lot of us are that way. We have places where we feel that if we put the effort in, we will get better. In other areas, we have these kind of sets, minds that, yeah, trouble areas. So some people around sports have that growth mindset. A lot of academic or students feel things like math, writing, drawing, for myself, singing. We have those fixed mindsets where we feel we're born a certain way and there isn't much we can do about it. So we need to help our students overcome those fixed mindsets, especially around intelligence. It's that myth that a lot of students were kind of born with, that they're just born a certain way and there isn't anything they can do about it. And what we know about intelligence has really changed a lot. A lot about the brain has changed. We always thought that we're born with 80 to 100 billion neurons, brain cells, and that was it. But we know so much more now. We know that we're constantly creating new neurons in the hippocampus. And the brain is very plastic, it's very malleable, and is always changing. So we need to help our students have a growth mindset versus a fixed. And a lot of the students who have that fixed mindset, that they give up more easily, as well, some of them turn to cheating. Why do they turn to cheating? Because they think they can't do it. They're born this way. I was born this way. I can't do math, but I need the math credit. So they turn to cheating, and we don't want that. We want them to focus on the learning and it being able to achieve. Let's move to grit. Now, grit has been popularized by Duckworth from University of Pennsylvania. She wrote a book recently, but she's done research now for over a decade. And other researchers, actually many people have done research on grit. Some people think of it as other constructs similar as perseverance, persistence. But really, it's that persistence to overcome challenges to reach their goals. Now think for a second. Do your students have challenges? They do, more than ever. If you think about the students who have a job at the same time as go to school full time, as well, not only a job, they'll have a family as well, and all the life experiences that brings, as well as academic potentially issues as well. So our students have lots of challenges. And what I'd like to do today is talk about how do we help our students persist and overcome some of those challenges to accomplish their academic goals. I'm hoping a lot of your students have those goals where they know why they're in the program and where they're headed. Some of our students don't know that, where they're going, but they're here for some reason, and I'm hoping we can help them be successful. Now, Duckworth's research looked at a lot of traits, IQ, social intelligence, and other traits. And what she found is grit was a predictor of success. Not only success in life, but academic success as well. So academic success, life success. But if you look at the definition of grit, your ability to overcome challenges to reach your goals. It's almost the definition of success. It's your ability to reach where you want to go. And the ability to overcome those challenges. Now, the big piece is, and I talked about this earlier on, but I want to reinforce it, grit can be developed. And some of you might think, well, just like in math, we're born with certain math skills or things. Are we born with some grit? The answer is yes. We are some, at about 37%. But the other 63% of our trait of grit can be developed. And I know some of you are wondering, how do we know that it's about 37% grit? I think Peter's making things up. Anyone have any ideas on how we know that? Any thoughts? How did researchers come up with that? They do. It is asking people, but certain special people. It is children, but it's also adults, but it is special people, twins. Identical twins who are genetically the same and fraternal twins who aren't genetically the same, but are raised in similar environments. So what they have done is the research with the twin studies to say that approximately 37% of the trait grit you're born with, but 63% you can develop and change. Hence, our work here today. Now, let's start with metacognition. And I'll talk about a few, but I'm going to start with exams because as educators, often we give exams. How many of you give exams at some point? Do we have quite a few hands? There's quite a few hands. And those that don't give exams, you're lucky. You're very lucky if you don't. But let's talk about exam prep first of all. Now, I want you to think about this question I've got for you. Again, I surveyed 2,500 students and I asked them this question. Do you study the way you do because a teacher taught you to? What percent going to the University of British Columbia, coming in first year, study the way they do because a teacher taught them to? What do you think? Luckily, it's not that 10% piece.
Isn't it lower than that?
Luckily, it's not lower than that. Maybe it is here. I'm saying at UBC context. I don't know here. What percent study the way they do because they were taught?
50.
That would be nice. I would love that. Instead, I won't draw it out. It's 20. And it's very consistent. I've done this a number of years. And I don't know why. And I did go to Okanagan College and did this with a first-year biology, but it was a small sample of like 35. I have large samples at UBC because our first-year biology class is 300. But 1 in 5, around 19 to 20% tell me they study the way they do because someone taught them to. So a lot of them, guess what they're doing? They're using ineffective strategies. So what I recommend is taking, if you do have them do tests, 5 minutes. Take 5 minutes out of your busy time and help them out or get them talking about effective strategies. If you look at the first page of the handout I gave you, right, the front cover, take a look for a second. I have some evidence-based. This one is an example from a first-year biology. Now, I highlight three important ones. Number one, I talk about practice testing. Why is practice testing so good? Number one, practice testing helps reinforce the memory, reinforce learning, really helps with the learning. But just as importantly, especially for our first-year students, when they practice test, they start to know what they know and what they don't know. They find their gaps. It lets them know where their strengths and weaknesses are so they can become a more effective and efficient learner. So they can focus their energies where they need to focus their energies. Because from my experience, they don't know what they don't know. And that causes all sorts of problems. So practice testing is one that I try to promote. Here's number two that I talk about. Study groups. What's so big about study groups? Well, social learning. Some of us in the room are socio-constructivists. The whole idea of learning is social. Peer teaching someone. You learn it at a completely different level. If you have to explain it to someone, or even just talking about a topic to someone, you learn it at a different level. Also, that support mechanism. There's that support and that structure, a time when you're going to meet your study group. There's a lot of benefits. Richard Light at Harvard, he did a study, looked at all these different kind of traits and factors of student success. It's funny, he didn't look at metacognition, grit, or anything, but he looked at a lot of different characteristics. And what he found, because it was a report back to the president at Harvard, said, if a student was able to find or maintain a study group, they were going to be successful. So that's another good piece around helping our students be successful. Help them get a study group. The third thing, how many of your students are nervous come exam time? Boy, that's common. Well, it's common with myself. How many of you were athletes, student athletes at any time? Students, athletes? How many use visualization in athletics? Hey, yeah. I find students know visualization. Visualization or cognitive rehearsal, very important in sports. Now, those that use visualization, how many use it for your academics? Learning. Oh, good. Good. It helps. So let me go through kind of a scenario. So visualization in sports, maybe I'm a track star, sprinter. So the night before my sprint, just as I'm going to sleep, I'll see myself at the line. I'll see myself get form. I hear the gun go off. I see myself taking off and seeing myself in perfect form, running that race, feeling very comfortable and confident. That's visualization. Let's move that over to students night before the exam. Just as they're going to sleep, they see themselves in the exam room. They're writing the test. They're going through some of the questions in their head. They feel confident. They feel comfortable. It's a positive experience. They see themselves finishing the exam, handing it in. And then the next day when it happens, they'd already done it. They feel a lot more comfortable because they wrote it the night before. It's that cognitive rehearsal. They feel a little bit more relaxed and the anxiety comes down a little bit. And what's nice is a lot of them had used visualization in sports, but thought, I had no idea I could use it for learning as well. So helping students with some strategies, and that front page is just some examples. You have some too. And it's also maybe to point out some of the myths or some of the ineffective ones as well. A lot of students will highlight, and when they highlight, they feel, yeah, I know it because I highlighted it. Or they'll reread the chapter, and on the second time through, they're thinking, yeah, this sounds really familiar. I know it. Well, of course, you just read it just before. And they have this kind of overconfidence that, yeah, they know it because they just reread it. Not an effective strategy because it kind of gives them a false sense that they know the material. So to help them with some strategies is really key. That's up front. But I'd like you to over the page on that page, because on the back is where the power is. So giving them some strategies is really key. But on the back is a plan. How many of your students actually plan? They're busy. They have jobs, they have family, they have more than one class, many of them. And if they don't create a plan, it's like the night before and whoa, I've got to quickly cram. And we see that cramming and grade is inversely correlated. It's not a good thing. So being able to plan and think about what strategies, when are you going to do it, spacing your practice, which is really key, being strategic and creating a plan. That's just an example of a plan. How long does it take them to create that plan? 3 minutes? 4 minutes? Whether you give them class time or not, I don't care, but maybe they should create a plan. Then I encourage them after they create a plan to tell someone. Why do I have them tell someone their plan? Why?
Accountability.
Thank you. Yeah. How many of you create New Year's resolutions? I do. If I tell someone, am I more likely to do it? If I keep it to myself, I have a way out. That's same with this plan. I've created a plan, I tell someone, I share it, I feel a little bit more accountability. But as well, just think what happened. I'm having a conversation with someone else about studying for a test. And I might get some ideas from them. And I might share some of my ideas. And they're all of a sudden talking about studying. That's what we want our students to do. So that's up front, before the exam. Spend 5 minutes with them, sharing some ways to study. Get them to spend 2 or 3 minutes actually creating a plan. Have them at some point share it with someone. Then they write their test. Are we done? Of course not. A lot of students will get their exam back, 68. And just, that's it. Take a look at the next handout. This is an exam reflection. And this is really key. Because a lot of students, without reflecting on how it went, will just use the same ineffective strategies over and over again. At the top of the page, it asks, what do you think you got for a grade when you left the room? Well, a lot of them think, well, I got an 80 or something good. And then it says, what'd you actually get? And is it the same? Then it starts asking them questions. Well, how many classes did you attend? Did you actually plan? Did you cram? What were the habits or things that you did leading up to the exam? And then at the bottom of that page, it asks, what strategies did you use? So on that first page is, what things did you do leading up to the exam? And then over the page, at the top of the next page, at the back of that page, it asks them, now where'd you lose your grades? Where'd you lose your marks? So the front page, what they did to prepare. Top of the back page, back of that page, where'd they lose their marks? But the most important thing is right under there. It asks, what are you going to do next time? In other words, we're asking them to reflect on how they learned to become a more effective learner. What strategies work? What strategies don't work? What things do you want to continue? What things do you want to change? How many of your students naturally do this without something like this? Not all. That's why it'd be good to even show them something like this. Have them reflect. How long does it take to do this reflection? 3 minutes? Maybe 4? It's not a huge commitment. They aren't tough questions. They don't have to really problem solve or anything. But what it does is teach them how to reflect on what they did and how they can learn better. That's an example. Question about that intervention? Thoughts? Questions?
Yeah, it's more of a connection than a question. I was just thinking that this is a good technique to interrupt the further solidification of a fixed mindset, because when I'm a student and I get back a 68, so yeah, that's just what I knew about myself. I'm a 68 student in math.
Right.
And
excellent. Yes.
This would be a good way to sort of break into that.
Exactly. I'm with you on that. That's a really good insight. So they aren't just kind of saying, yeah, I'll never do well because I was born that way. There could have actually been some strategies that were ineffective that they were doing to get that 68. Good, I like that. Good insight. Anyone else? Okay, let's talk about another intervention. This one is an assignment wrapper. Now, I'm going to zip back to that metacognition piece. This one. Now, remember how we said about 10% do this? This is the thing to help them learn. If you look at, so I give them a major project, an assignment. This is a scaffold to help them think about what are the types of questions I need to ask myself in order to do this project effectively. What's the first title? Assess the demands of the task, isn't it? I think something like that. Then it gives some questions. What's my prof really asking me to do? And it breaks down for them some of those questions they should be asking themselves. Then the next main heading is evaluate their own knowledge and skills. So where are their strengths, where are their weaknesses? So it's helping them. And then on the next heading, is planning. They create a plan. How are they going to do the project? And then it talks about monitoring their project progress and what kinds of questions they should be asking themselves to monitor their learning. Then it talks about reflecting on, how many of you give rubrics out? Those with rubrics, there's a piece in there as well that asks, how is my assignment compared to the rubric? Because if my prof has marked me on here, where am I at? So it'd be good before they hand it in to kind of check that. A lot of students do. And then also on that handout, they look at the feedback from the professor. How does that inform their learning? But one of the end question is, they reflect on that whole process they went on, and it asks, what are they going to do differently next time when they have to complete a project or a paper, so that they learn how to learn. So this little scaffold helps them with that. Would I use it in just a simple assignment, like do questions 5 to 7 at the back of the textbook? Of course not. This is for major projects. It's helping them learn how to learn, what expert learners do. What you told me 10% of your students already do, this is helping the other 90% with this type of thinking. Questions about this intervention? Oops. Does it look okay? Do you wonder whether students will actually do it or hand it in? You're already having a tough time getting them to complete the project. There's a few different ways around that, because it's often the students who are really good who will do this. The students who are having trouble, a lot of them already having. Sometimes profs have them handed in with their project as part of the marks for motivation, if you feel. And some people just use it for some people in their class as an option to help them learn how to learn. How many have a project management background? Anyone have project management? Does this look kind of familiar to project management as well? I went to another university, and that's what they said. I have a project management background. This looks like project management. I said, yeah, it does, but that's a good thing. A lot of students need a little project management in their lives. It gives them some structure, some things to do. So that's good. Now, the whole idea of reflection. The power of reflection is really key. We've talked about in the exam piece how it's really important for them to reflect on what they did to prepare for that exam and then possibly change a few things. That's really key. So reflection is a tool that will enhance the way they learn, but it also helps cognitively processing and helps them learn the material. And we reflect all the time. But here's a powerful quote I'd like to share. You wouldn't know this, sorry. This is University of British Columbia, the Japanese Gardens at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. If anyone recognizes it? Yeah, it's nice. Very nice. This is Fish Lake up in the Yukon, just outside of Whitehorse. Another reflection I took. But actually, I want to focus on what the quote is. Some of you know John Dewey, very famous educational theorist. And this is really important, especially this first part. We do not learn from experience. That's powerful, because experiential learning is so important, and of course we learn from experience, but it's the second part of the quote that's really important. So we do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And that's really powerful and really spoke to me in the power of reflection. Reflecting is really key part of learning, because I really believe strongly in experiential learning. We learn by doing and experiencing, but it's that reflecting on it. And some of you have your students do a lot of reflecting. And those that do, especially at the beginning, if you haven't taught them how to reflect, they often just kind of summarize what they did without any analysis, without the kind of so what. They'll say that we did this experiment. I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. But they don't analyze the so what and relate it to how does that change their thinking? How does that relate to them or their real life or anything? They need to do the analysis phase. So what we do is we get them to practice as much as possible. And maybe at the end of class as an example, you might have them think about what were the most important ideas of the session. What did I hear today is in conflict with my prior understanding? How did these ideas of today's class session relate to previous class sessions? Getting them to stop and process. Because if you just end the class and they just get up and leave, and they miss that chance to just kind of cognitively process and think, what the heck just went on? What did I actually learn? A lot of them aren't naturally doing that. How many of you use a 1-minute paper? 1-minute paper? Or an exit ticket? How do you like 1-minute papers?
I like them in my online class because it's very hard for me to get feedback because we don't meet at the same time. It actually really helps me. I'm using it more of a teaching tool. I'm looking at there and saying, okay, where's the gap?
Exactly. So let's talk about that. It's a huge win-win. How long does it take? A minute. You ask the students, scrap piece of paper, what's one thing that I learned today, and what's one thing I have a question about. So they have to force themselves to think, oh, what did I just learn? And what do I have a question about? It actually gets them to stop and cognitively process. So it's a great learning event in a minute. They hand that in. And as you mentioned, great teaching tool. All of a sudden in your hands is powerful information that will inform your teaching. Why? Because all of a sudden you have what they thought they learned or what you thought they would. Hopefully it aligns with what you wanted them to learn, but also what questions do they have? So the next day you can address that. So it's a great teaching tool and a great learning tool. All in how long? 1 minute. So that's really key, just a 1-minute paper. And there's a lot of different variations that you could do with that. Another variation is the muddiest point. So you just ask them, what was the muddiest point today? Where was there some kind of confusion? And if there was some confusion, the second part is, how are you going to figure that out? And they need to figure that out. They need to write down, well, I found this confusing, and this is how I'm going to find the answer. I'm going to read, or I'm going to Google it, or I'm going to do something. But getting them to stop and process is really key part of their learning. A lot of them do not naturally reflect to that level of analysis. So helping them. Here's another one I do. So near the end of class, this one takes about 5 minutes. I get them to write down what were the 3 most important things that you learned today. So they write them down. Okay, you done? Okay. Then I flash out, because I don't write. I flash up. Here's what I thought were the 3 most important things that we should have learned today. Are they the same or different? And why? And it gets them practicing reflection. So getting them to practice reflection is good. and helping them with reflection is good. It doesn't have to take a long time, but helping them reflect will help them learn. Questions about reflection? Now, oh, sorry. Do you want to, key things, give them some time, whether it's 1 minute, 5 minutes, help them and teach them how to reflect. Teach them the analysis part, because if you just say reflect and write down a reflection, they'll say, well, we did this, and then we did that, and there won't be any analysis piece. And the other piece, have them reflect for the learning part, but also reflect to become a better learner. So they need to reflect on their learning, monitoring their learning, and thinking about their learning so they become a better learner. Now, what kinds of things are you doing around helping people plan, monitor, evaluate their learning? Any things that you'd like to share? Any activities that you're working with your students, or questions that you have about some of the things that I just shared?
I don't know how many people have had the Gym Studies 114 training, but that test-taking piece
Yeah.
where you give the test, it's just a one-page thing. Students sit down, they list every question they missed, and then they just check a box.
Sure.
Why did I miss it? It goes in this category. So I give that to my students the first time, and then any student who scores a failing score and
That's
wants to
it
come and
again.
talk to me gets to do it again, and we talk through it. The biggest thing that I discover is having a conversation and explaining test anxiety to
Yes.
students when that's what they're doing wrong. It's amazing. Just
Good.
because they know that they're not the only one. I
Yes.
have a PowerPoint that talks all about test anxiety, and I give them a copy.
Good.
So that really works.
Thanks for sharing. That's wonderful. Yes.
Well, the other thing that Jackie does is she sends her students who didn't do well on a test over to meet with the accounting tutor who goes through the test with them. And so she's identified what they did wrong, and they meet with a peer to talk about how they can do better in the next test.
That's great.
Yes.
It's that reflecting on their learning. And if we don't intervene and help them with these kind of things, a lot of them won't. So we need to help them learn how to learn so they become that lifelong learner. Just looking at time, let's keep going to growth mindset real quick here. So growth mindset, I do a lot of teaching, direct teaching about the brain and about themselves as well. So I shared with you the idea of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. Both concepts are very important for our students to understand, that our understanding of the brain has changed a lot. And the brain continually grows, is very plastic, very malleable. Sometimes what I'll do is talk about things like the gym. A lot of them go to the gym, and I talk to them about if for example, myself, if I go into the gym, I go over to the bench press and put 10 pounds on and do 3 sets of 8, what's that doing for me? Nothing. But if I go over to the bench press and put 150 to 200 pounds on and do 3 sets of 8, that challenge is actually helping me grow. Well, it tears the muscle, then it helps grow the muscle. And similarly with the brain, it's through challenge that really the learning happens. Without challenge, you don't have the change. And that's really important for a lot of students to understand, because a lot of them are challenged and they just think, I must be stupid. But really, the challenge is key, and it is where the learning happens. And a lot of you know about Bjork's work, professor at UCLA, around desirable difficulties. And the importance of that challenge and difficulty is where the real learning happens. Now, I also get them to think about themselves. And usually it's been a few weeks at least into school, but I get them to think of a time when they've pushed themselves outside their comfort zone to learn something new. So they reflect, and can they think of something? You bet they can. And then I have them think, well, you learned this really challenging thing. What do you think that impact was on your brain? Is your brain just static? Did anything happen? Of course not. It changes. It builds new connections, new wiring. Your brain is malleable. So I get them to think about this kind of thing, about their own experiences of when they're challenging and how that impacts the brain and how malleable the brain is. And I get them to watch this 3-minute video. Now, Marianne got to see the video twice yesterday when I worked with the students. But it really reinforces the idea that yes, you can grow your brain, you can grow your intelligence, which really reinforces that growth mindset. And that's what we're after. And so I also talk to them, just like I talked to you, about where they have a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. I'll come back to that. So in a lot of areas, like sports or other areas, they have a growth mindset. So I get them to identify where they have that growth mindset. So for example, I have a growth mindset in teaching. I know this because I continually try to improve my teaching and I incorporate feedback from my students. That's how I know I have a growth mindset. If I had a fixed mindset, I'd believe, well, I was born this way as a teacher, I'm pretty good at it, but there isn't much more I can do about it. But I have that growth mindset and I continually try to improve on that skill. And some of our students, maybe it is around football. So they have a growth mindset in football. How do we know that? Well, they continually try to improve, listen to when the coach points out things they need to work on. They need to find where they have that growth mindset, where they have that fixed mindset. And with also that direct teaching about, yeah, intelligence isn't fixed, it really helps them understand that, yeah, they need to have that growth mindset. And then they need to find places where they have a fixed mindset. Maybe they have that fixed mindset in math. So they need to reframe it. Instead of saying, yes, I'm just bad at math, I need to say, yes, I find math challenging. However, through effort, I can at least improve my math skills. I may never get to Einstein, but I can get up further than without doing anything about it. They can grow where they have a fixed mindset. Now, something that a lot of students, what reinforces a fixed mindset is the whole idea of natural talent. They look around and think, yeah, that person was just born that way. That's why they're so great at whatever it is. And often they don't see the behind the scenes about how much actual work goes into it. And an example of that would be someone like Michael Jordan, who I feel is the best basketball player of all time. And he's a perfect example of natural talent who wasn't naturally talented. A lot of people thought, yeah, he was born that way. Did he make his high school basketball team? So someone who didn't make his high school basketball team, was he born that way? Probably not. And if you watch kind of the video about becoming legendary, he talks about the extreme effort and hard work it took to become legendary. To become legendary requires a lot of work. And some of you know about Erickson's work around to become an expert, it's 10,000 hours of work. It's significant, and it's not just 10,000 hours of work, it's hours of putting effort in, getting feedback, incorporating the feedback, practicing again, and so on. It's being strategic. So it's really important for them to understand that, yeah, some people might have a little bit of natural talent, but often there's a whole lot of hard work that goes into being great. Now, before I get to that, that's the really important part is they can control their effort, but they can't control how much they're born with. So it's really important to kind of praise that effort rather than just how smart they are. How many have been over to London before? Anyone over London, England? Black cabs, very famous, these black cabs. If you haven't been over, you've probably seen the black cab at least. Now, these people have to pass a very difficult test. And it always surprises me because now with GPS, you can kind of cheat yourself by just using GPS. So they have to pass a knowledge test. They have to learn 320 routes through 25,000 streets, 20,000 landmarks to pass the test. Usually takes them about 3 years to learn. So it's very intense, very hard effort. Now what they did, and this kind of reinforces the idea of yes, we can actually grow our brain, they did MRI imaging, and these folks who learned and pushed themselves, their hippocampi posterior, part of the hippocampus where the learning happens, is much larger, significantly, compared to other people who don't do this type of thing. It's that whole idea of pushing yourself, challenging yourself. Through challenge, there's the growth. It just reinforces that, yes, we can grow our intelligence, giving the examples. Yes?
Do they know, were they able to tell if they had the larger hippocampi before?
Yeah, yes, they would have controlled for that. And I could, if you email me, I'll send you the research on it. But yes, yeah, they did. But it's a very good question. It is, and it just kind of reinforces the idea of the growth when you challenge yourself, and that's where the real learning, the new connections happen. Just like my example of the gym. When you go to the gym and really push yourself and grow your muscles, same idea with your intelligence. Now, before I get to that, I'm going to just wait because I'm going to bring grit into the picture and then talk more about growth mindset because they're related, especially around our view of failure. So I'm going to circle back in a second and bring more growth mindset in, but let's talk about grit. But before I get there, sometimes I'll flash this up in the middle of a session or in the middle of my class. Why? Because I want them monitoring their learning. And I just get them to just a quick monitor. What are they experiencing? What confusions do you have? It's that whole idea of cognitively processing and learning to monitor their learning and reflect not only at the end of a class, but throughout the class, kind of like what you were doing. You were monitoring your learning all the way through. So what questions are arising for me during this session? Am I writing them down? Do you find it interesting? Why or why not? And this is the big question. How could I make this material more personally relevant? Not the prof. How can I make it more relevant? In other words, how does what we're learning in class relate to me, my goals, where I'm headed? Getting them to kind of ask these kinds of questions and monitor their learning. So I just flashed this up for them. But let's talk grit. So here's a framework I've got some time to go through with you. So just as a reminder about grit. Grit is your persistence to overcome challenge to reach your goals. So how do we develop that grit? Well, here's kind of a framework. First of all, I'll talk about, and then I'll give you some strategies. Provide challenging goals. So, if my goals for my students are here, where do they learn to? Right here. If my goals are up here, where are they learning to? Up here. Now you know where your students are and you know how to challenge them. Doesn't mean you kill them or you make it so ridiculous that half your class can't make it. The key is just to make it challenging so that they're challenging themselves, but not ridiculous. And if you're going to challenge, you need to communicate those high expectations to them so they know where that bar is and why. You're not having these high expectations because you're a cruel and sadistical teacher. It's because you want them to learn. They pay their money. The whole idea is to learn. And if they're just sitting in class and doing nothing, how much are they learning? Nothing. They need to challenge themselves. Through challenge the growth will occur. Now, another piece of that is the student goal setting. So we want them to set goals that align with kind of your goals, where you're headed, what you want them to do. And that gives them a roadmap, that gives them motivation, that kind of the blueprint of where they're headed. A lot of students, especially in the professional programs like nursing or something, they know where they're going. They have that goal. Linking that goal to what you're doing is really key. Now, another part of overcoming challenge to reach the goals is to have a growth mindset. If they have a fixed mindset, they're going to give up more easily, which isn't very gritty. But if they have that growth mindset and believe that the more effort they put in, they'll reach their goals, that's going to help them with their grit. So helping with growth mindset will help them. And I'll give you another piece of strategy that's very important in a minute. Now let's talk strategy though. So to help them get to their goals, they shouldn't just put effort in, they need strategic effort. Hence, metacognition. Planning their learning, monitoring their learning, reflecting on their learning and becoming a better learner. That helps them reach their goals. Another big piece, student support. Does that mean you as a prof, you give your cell number and say 24/7 anytime? Of course not. What it means is having and communicating some kind of support system, whether that's helping peers, students, this is how you create a study group, or there's the library, the writing center, math center, all sorts of supports, but communicating with them those kinds of supports, having some kind of support. So if you're going to have high expectations, you want to have some kind of support system in place as well. And often as faculty, we just assume they all know those supports. Some do, some don't. Some as profs, we don't always know all the supports available. So it's something to consider. Let's go through some examples and strategies. So this was a research study that I didn't do, but it's an important one. And it's about communicating high expectations and giving feedback on papers. So what they did to a large sample, they put a little extra feedback on the papers randomly. So on some of them, they put, I am giving you these comments so you have feedback on your paper. Okay. Take a look at this option though. I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations. So you're communicating those high expectations. And I know you can reach them, which is that belief in them as well. So that simple little intervention is communicating and reinforcing the idea that yes, I have high expectations, which then they think, yeah, this is why I got that mark. It isn't because he hates me or she hates me. It's because they have high expectations. I need to reach and push a little harder. And the results were the students were then going through that feedback, making the edits, making the changes, and that's what as faculty we want. because often we spend so many hours giving feedback without students actually incorporating and using the feedback. Goal setting. Now, with goal setting, as I mentioned, it's important for them to set some kind of goals. And in another intervention, in another experiment, what they did is they wanted them to have a sense of purpose, of why they were in the class. When they have a sense of purpose, does that impact their motivation and what they're going to do? Of course. So what this group did is they wanted to reflect and kind of see how what they were doing in the class related to some greater purpose, whether that's their goal of where they wanted to go professionally or even contributing to their community or being kind of models to other people, but some kind of purpose. So helping students set goals that help them see purpose or a relationship between what you're doing in your class with their goal really helps. Failure. This one's kind of sad because a lot of our students really fear failure. And it's to be expected. A lot of us believe that failure's bad. It's devastating and should be avoided. Now, Carol Dweck, who's the big growth mindset person, her PhD student, maybe about 2 years ago now, went into the malls in San Francisco and she surveyed the parents and the kids. What she was looking at, she thought the parents' view of growth or their mindset towards intelligence would rub off on their kids. But that isn't what she found. She found that the parents' view of failure rubbed off on the kids and impacted their mindset towards intelligence. So parents who believe that failure is devastating, should be avoided at all costs, those kids had a fixed mindset towards intelligence. Those parents who believe that, yes, failure happens, we need to learn from failure, pick ourselves up and keep going, those kids had a growth mindset towards intelligence. So our view of failure is very important, and it impacts a growth mindset. And so we need to think about failure and really what failure is all about, because we fail every day. And a lot of students don't see it. And as faculty, we need to sometimes share that. How many of you have written grants? Grants? How many grants do you have to write to get one grant? What do the students hear? Oh yeah, I got the grant. They didn't see, oh, I wrote 10 grants. 9 of them failed. 1 got through. Yay, 1. They never hear about the 9 that didn't. And we don't talk about. But every time as faculty we write a grant and we don't get it, we think about, well, why didn't we get it? I need to change it. We need to learn from it. Often we fail, but we need to share that it does happen. And so sometimes we talk about and share some of our own experiences. Sometimes we talk about some of the famous people who failed and that it is okay, that they got through to the other side and did great things when they failed. Here's a couple examples. Many of you know about Thomas Edison, how many times it took to get to the light bulb. We don't talk about the 10,000 times he tried and failed, but in science, that's what we do when we create something. We try it, it doesn't work, so we make a change. We try it, doesn't work, we make change, and that's how it works. And that's what Thomas Edison, if he would have given up after 9,000 times, may have been a few extra months before we had a light bulb. Or years. Steve Jobs they can relate to. Why? Because they have something that Steve Jobs has, most of them have. And Steve Jobs is an excellent example. He and Woz created Apple computers in the 70s. A little time later, what happened after creating the company? He got the boot. Now, did he go crawl into his parents' basement and stay there for the rest of his years? No, he didn't. He came back bigger, stronger, to create the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone, the everything, and really contribute. And this is a famous quote, that when he got fired, he didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Why? Because it took that learning experience to change his direction. Obviously, the board fired him. Why? Because he was bringing the company down. It took something big to say, hold it, Steve, you got to change your ways. And so he learned from that and came back and led the company to do great things. So our view of failure is very important and influences the mindset. Now, something that I do with my child every day is around failure, around some of these other things. Because I want them to embrace challenge, through challenge, change occurs, I ask them every night, what's one thing that challenged you today, and what did you learn from it? Then I ask them, what were 3 good things that happened, and why were they good? So I want them to have that attitude of gratitude. Some of you know the positive psychology around that. But then I ask them, tomorrow, what are you going to do to challenge yourself? And because I'm pushing them to challenge, what's going to happen? The failure. So the next thing I ask them, in the last week, what's one thing that you failed at, and what'd you learn from it? Because if you're not failing, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. You're not challenging yourself, and failure is going to happen sometimes. Do I want them to do devastating, terrible things? No. That would be silly. But do I want them to push themselves? Yeah. And they have to realize that failure is going to happen, and we need to learn from it. And do I want all your students to fail your class just so that they learn from it? Of course not. But sometimes it's going to happen. And what Carol Dweck kind of reinforces is the whole not yet. They didn't get it yet, but they need to push themselves and get there. And yeah, not yet, but they will get there. Have that growth mindset. Now, what we need to do is talk about what we just talked about for the last hour and 15 minutes. I want you to reflect on, what did we talk about? Think about your own context. What could you use? What couldn't you use? Maybe it's just something small. Oh, maybe I'll just try a 1-minute paper and reflection. Or maybe I'll try an exam reflection or something. I want you to kind of cognitively process what just happened and how does it relate to you. And to help you with that reflection, I'm going to have you just have a quick discussion with the people around you around what we just did. And then we'll wrap it up in about 6 minutes. So have a conversation about what did we just talk about those 3 constructs. Help yourself process it, talk it through, have a conversation. So just turn to some people around you, have a conversation. Okay, I need to cut you off. I apologize for kind of cutting you off because I spent a lot of time saying the importance of reflecting, and that's what you were doing, and having a conversation. Hopefully you realize kind of what happened just now, where you kind of reflected on what happened, took you to a different level, whereas if I would have just cut you off and say, thanks very much, see you later, that was really powerful, being able to talk about what just happened. And it gives you that reflection piece. Now, any comments or questions about what happened in the last hour, 25 minutes, or things you want to try, or questions? Anyone like to do any sharing before we go today? Any sharers?
Well, I'm just hoping that, are we going to be able to get
Yep.
this presentation?
Yep. And all the handouts digitally. They're all in Word, so you can just make some changes in Word to meet your context and use it. I've got a link that will be sent out to you, and you just go to the link and all the files will be there.
So, I'm sorry, can I go back to his question?
Yes.
How-
Oh, yes,
yes.
okay. Yes, let's go back. Circle back.
I don't feel like your question was answered, and I was interested in the answer myself.
Which one? He had two questions. Which
Mine
one?
was the how do you help them with this and not put yourself in a position of a counselor? Because
Right.
boundaries are very difficult here.
So what we did is a whole buffet of things, right? Depending on what your role is and who you are as a teacher. I didn't expect you to do all of these things. It's, here's a buffet. What kinds of things might you use that align with who you are as a teacher, that fit with your context, that fit with your goals? Because you're right, you're not a therapist, and you need to kind of realize that, yes, I can teach them to reflect. If I teach them to reflect, I'm not being a therapist or anything, I'm just teaching them how to learn. Or if I get them to do an exam planning exercise, teach them plan, monitor, that has nothing to do with therapy. What that is a learning strategy. So you're teaching them a learning strategy. So you can just stay totally away from the positive psychology kinds of things if you don't feel comfortable with it. Or you could start your class with, what's one thing that went really well today? And they need to reflect, oh yeah, that went well, and why? Well, that would be a positive psychology kind of more therapist, but it depends who you are. So what I gave you is kind of the buffet of a lot of different options of things that might align with who you are. So if you're not that far, that kind of leaning, go with the learning strategy. Yes?
So I have a comment and a question. My
Good.
comment is, one of the takeaways for me is that a lot of these strategies can be found through formative assessment activities.
Yes. Yes.
So I think, where I will go from here, we'll continue down the path of working on that. The question I have is, how do we draw students into the physical world of learning and vie for their energy and attention away from the digital platforms that, the social media, et cetera,
Yeah.
where, a great article in the Community College Humanities Association Journal last spring about the idea that in the digital social media environment, they're not becoming anything, they're choosing and not having to overcome the challenges. So how do we compete for and work with our students who struggle to stay with us, the grit part, when it's so easy to escape it?
Sure. Are you thinking, in two terms, I'm thinking, are you thinking in a classroom experience? Are they engaged? Or just with the class so that they see purpose and will do the work outside of class? Are you thinking even in class where there people at the back are on Facebook and that kind of thing?
Well, again, I think in class, the formative assessment activities, but I still, I'm looking at my classes now at this point in the quarter and the year, 50% doing great, 25% doing okay, and then there's the 25% that are just.
How do you reach that
How do you
25?
reach that? And,
Yeah.
and that's the challenge I see.
So you got to think about why those 25% aren't there. Whether it's what kind of challenge. Is it that what do you teach, for an example?
I teach photography and digital media production, which is why I don't do as many exams.
I would think that would be an elective, and I would think a lot of people would be interested in passion. So it's finding that passion, helping them realize what they're doing in your class and how it really relates to where they're headed, to themselves. Building that kind of bridge is really key so that they can see, because if they don't see what they're doing in class to their future or about themselves, that's where a lot of dropout. And it's the relevancy factor. And sometimes we think, well, that 50% that are really doing well, we don't have to bridge it for them. We have to bridge it for that 25% outliers that really don't see the relevancy. We need to help them find relevancy and purpose and why they are in your class. Otherwise, the motivation won't be there. There's all sorts of in-class strategies that you can use, like team-based learning and things like that, to get them kind of learning and engaged, but they also at the same time have to see purpose. And helping them, we shouldn't have to. You would think, especially something like yours, they would be choosing to go to something like that, but sometimes we have to help them get there.
I think you made a really important point by saying that, like, students, I think a lot of times are going to college because they don't have anything else to do. They don't know that they're making an active choice to be here. And there's like this big gap between students that are here and choosing to be here and wanting to learn versus not, like, inactively making that choice. And that's a hard thing to get students to, like, see and notice.
That is, it is. And some of them don't have that passion yet. They don't know their passion yet. Some do, like the ones that are going into nursing and some of the professional programs. They know their passion, they know where they're headed. For some of the rest of us, we need to help bridge that. But thanks so much for coming out and spending some time this afternoon. Thank you.